Hello and welcome back to this newest episode of Two Peas in a Pod. I am
Hello.
Aaron Herskowitz.
I am Sam Liebens.
Hi Sam, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm raring to go. What's the topic today?
So since hopefully when we publish this will be right before Shavuot, we're going today to talk about learning Torah with your children.
Lovely. Wonderful.
Important. Yeah.
So should we start with the Torah corner?
I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
It's very meta. Talk about Torah, using Torah.
The Torah corner.
Okay, I want to actually bring a couple of sources, a few different ones, to start with the Rambam in his Code of Law, the Mishna Torah. One of the books is Hilchot Talmud Torah, the laws of studying Torah. And we might have thought that the way that the Rambam would begin these laws of Torah study would be to discuss the obligation one has to learn Torah. And indeed he does discuss that. He writes, Kol ish miYisrael chayav b'Talmud Torah, ben ani, ben ashir, ben shalem begufo, ben bal yisurin, ben bachur, ben shaya zaken gadol, shetashash kocho. That every Jewish man is obligated to study Torah, whether poor or rich, whether whole in their body, WH, or if they are experiencing physical ailments, whether young or very old, that he no longer has strength. Still, he continues, I'm not going to quote the whole thing, still one is required likboa lo zman letalmud Torah b'yom u'v'layla, to set aside time to study Torah day and night, shne'amar v'hagita bo yomam v'layla. One must discuss and learn Torah both at day and at night. So this is how one perhaps would have thought that the Rambam would begin his laws of Torah study with the obligation that one has to study. And yet this halacha is halacha chet, the 8th law in the Rambam's first chapter. He actually starts with the following. Halacha aleph, the first law is Nashim va'avadim ktanim p'turim mitalmud Torah. He starts off specifically with those who are exempt from Torah study, women and slaves and minors. I mean, we should at some point discuss topics related to women, girls, daughters, wives. It's important to know that in terms of the formal obligation of Torah study, so it's different for men and for women. And there's a whole long discussion in terms of women's obligation, their ability also to recite the daily blessings on Torah study. In general, we say that women should recite the blessings on Torah study, together with the command, right? Blessed are you, Hashem, who has commanded us to learn Torah, because of the fact that they are also obligated to learn Torah, but the obligation is different. We'll get into that more another time. But so then right after that,
controversial elements of the Rambam, he does say, among other things, that it's a mitzvah but not an obligation for women to learn. So
okay,
I'll just throw that in.
Elsewhere, you
Elsewhere.
Okay, fine. You'll have to show me the source later. Okay. Aval katan, the Rambam continues, aviv chayav lelamdo Torah. But despite this exemption, a child is not obligated to learn Torah. Despite this, a child, his father is obligated to teach him Torah. Shne'amar v'limadtem otam ebenichem ledaber bam. You shall teach your sons to speak these words. Ve'ein ha'isha chayavet lelamed et bena. Shekol chayav lilmod chayav lilamed. But a woman is not obligated to teach her son, because only those who have this formal obligation that I shared before are obligated to teach. Also, in terms of the parents' obligation too, so there's also a discussion based off of, I'm not going to get into all of the details, but different understandings of a Gemara and Masechet Naz in terms of whether a mother is obligated from a Torah perspective to, in the mitzvah of chinuch, in the command to educate one's son, one's children. It's machloket, a dispute, both perhaps in the Gemara and in Rishonim and in the Achronim in terms of that obligation. But Rav Asher Weiss writes, and he writes that he saw afterwards in the Chazon Ish as well, that it's clear that what we're talking about here is in terms of a formal type of obligation. But in terms of one's parental duties and obligations, both mothers and fathers are obligated to teach both their sons and their daughters about what it means to be a Jew, to teach them our way of life, to teach them Torah, to set them on the right path. And that what we are discussing is more in terms of like an organized type of formal list of rules and obligations. But in terms of the basic obligation that one has towards their children, that's more all-encompassing. Just to put that in the side. But the reason that I wanted to bring this Rambam as the Torah source is because of the fact that this is how he starts the laws of Torah study. Not with one's individual obligation to learn, but he very much centers it in the beginning on one's obligation to teach their children about Torah. And
just to interject.
Go ahead, yeah.
It's in Law 13, quite a bit later. He doesn't use the word mitzvah. I must correct myself. He uses the word sachar for reward.
And for a woman who studies Torah.
He says that a woman who studies Torah, she is eligible for reward, even though she's not obligated. Anyway.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of how we colloquially use the word mitzvah, so in other words, that it's perhaps, in other words,
it could be considered
a good thing to do.
Yeah.
But not an outright obligation. Okay, Thank you for that addition. An additional halacha in this chapter is from at what point is a father obligated to teach his son Torah? Mishiatchil ledaber melamdo Torah tivadanu Moshe ve'Shema Yisrael. When a child is able to speak, then his father ought to teach him these two verses that Moshe commanded us to keep the Torah, is one pasuk, and the second one is Shema Yisrael, right? The basic tenets of Jewish faith, and also in terms of verses that connect all of Am Yisrael. Listen, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, right? They stand so centrally to Jewish identity, both in terms of being at the beginning of one's life and also at the end of one's life. Also, it's meant to be recited, right? Remember multiple stories on October 7th and 8th when people were being saved from their safe rooms after many hours and longer being stuck there and being afraid of, well, maybe the terrorists are trying to trick me to come out by claiming that they're security forces, they're the army. And the way that many people were convinced was that those on the outside said Shema Yisrael, right? Said this pasuk. But that's where the obligation begins. Once a child can speak, then his father has to teach him these words. And then the Rambam says, "V'achar kach melamdo me'at psukim psukim." And then he begins to teach him bit by bit more and more verses, ad sheyeh ben shesh or ben sheva, until the child is 6 or 7. Hakol lefi baryo, according to the child's strength and ability. Umulicho etza melamed hadidokot. And then at that point, he takes him to the teacher, who will continue his education. So this is the first source that I wanted to bring, but I wanted to bring a second one also, which sort of overlaps with this, which is the Mishnah in Masechet Avot, in Mishnah Chaf Aleph. The Mishnah quotes, continuing from the previous Mishnah, which has the statements of Yehuda ben Tema, as the Mishnah says, Hu Haya Omer. Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema, said the following: 5 years old, one should start learning. One should learn what we would call Tanakh, right, scripture. When they are 10, they should learn Mishnah. Ben Shoshesrei mitzvot. When they're 13, they are obligated in mitzvot. Ben Chameshesrei Talmud. 15 is the study of Talmud. Ben Shmonasar lechuppah. 18 is when one should get married. Ben Esrim li'irdof. And then at 20, they start to chase. And then the Mishnah continues to expound on the other later developmental stages also. And it's an interdiscussion because the first few dealt very much with Torah study and educational stages. There are those who also connect the later stages also to similar levels, not just talking about life stages, but also in terms of Torah study. So, for example, the Magen Avot, the Meiri on Mishnah Avot says that being 20 years old, so in terms of chasing at 20 years old, so some explain what that means is that they're out and they're active in life, right, relating more to the life stage. Others talk about chasing, meaning that they're going to apply practically all of the mitzvot that they've learned. And others say, so the Magen Avot, he writes that ve'achar kach mechazer al talmudo. At the age of 20, then he begins to review all that he studied. Shaharei lamad kol tzorcho, because he's already learned all that he needs. V'hainu bet nisrim l'irdof shirdof achar talmudo. Right, and then he starts chasing his studies, chasing everything that he's learned. He's going over and over again at that point. In terms of these different stages that are mentioned in the Mishnah, so I'll talk about it in the psychology corner a little bit and how it overlaps somewhat, at least, with different understandings of cognitive development that we have. But there are a number of points that I want to mention in this regard. One is that we see from the Mishnah that it's clear that there are stages. In other words, that we're very cognizant of the fact that children change and develop. And for that reason, they said that in terms of what it is that they should be taught, what it is that they should be studying, it changes over the course of time. That's number one. That's important to keep in mind. And number two is in terms of how the stages are spaced from one another, that the learning stages are all 5 years apart. And this is connected to the idea that really it takes 5 years to gain mastery over a certain subject, over a certain body of knowledge. And other ideas that Chazal mentioned, that if one has been studying for 5 years and has not succeeded, then that should be a sign that maybe it's not for them. So that's why for the 5 years. Yeah. So that's why the 5 years is for Tanakh, 5 years for Mishnah, 5 years for Talmud. And then the Meiri also in the Magen Avot discusses the fact that there seems to be other sources as well that talk about different ages that a child is supposed to learn, perhaps younger, perhaps older. Right? We saw in the Rambam that it's not 5, not at the age of 5 that they start to. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you need to start them even earlier than this on the one hand. But in terms of further development, you start later. The Rambam doesn't talk about 5; he talks about 6 or 7. Which is based off of other sources. And part of the idea, I think the Meiri and Magen Avot talks about it, but it's really connected to what we saw in the Rambam also, is that there's different types of learning too. That you have learning that takes place in the home, where in the family environment, it can and should perhaps be gentler and more related to the child's individual development and more centered on the relationship, which are all things that we're going to talk about, and hopefully in the psychology and also in the practical corner. And then only at a later stage, when the child is able to handle being in a large environment, then you can put them in a place where hopefully there is still personal attention and a sense of connection and care, but school is usually less personal than in the home environment. And that's also what's an important developmental aspect as well, right? And we saw that in the Rambam, that a father starts teaching bit by bit, and then when he's 6 or 7, depending on the child's ability, not just learning ability, but also emotional ability, right? Can he be in the school? Can he handle the difficulties that are prevalent in the Israeli Jewish educational system or not? And at that point, then you hand them over and your obligations towards your children have ceased. No, not really. Right? Then you know, that it's supposed to be adding another layer in their studies, but that obligation that parents have towards their children continues.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, is the Rambam presenting an ideal, that it's ideal for the parent once the child is able to hand them over to a teacher for supplementary education, or more likely for their main education that the parents can continue to supplement? Or is the Rambam saying if the father isn't capable of, and the ideal would be that the father should teach the child, if the father's a tremendous Talmud Chacham, then the father should do all of the teaching? Or is the Rambam saying no, there's an ideal that other voices should be introduced at a certain point in time?
Yeah, so there are other sources also that talk about this as well, and there are different models too, right? We have. There are, in terms of different Gedolim, great sages in the 21st century. There were those who grew up in yeshiva frameworks and those who did not. They were taught
by their parents,
by their fathers, by their family, whatever it is. Yeah.
Interesting.
Indeed. The Philosophy Corner.
Well, the philosophy of education is a massive field, and in fact, sometimes it's not taught in the philosophy department at all, and it's taught in education departments, and it's clearly aligned with developmental psychology, which I'm sure you'll be talking about, Aaron, in the psychology corner.
How did you know?
The philosophy of education as a Western concern goes all the way back to Plato, and in fact there's a fundamental machloket between Plato and Aristotle that reverberates to this day. Plato had the idea, or at least Plato attributes this idea to Socrates, that learning, the process of learning, is really a process of recalling. And the explanation is that before the soul entered the body of the child, the soul was in heaven and was directly acquainted with all of the ideal forms, the structures and ideas that, let me put this another way, there's this notion called a Platonic form, and perhaps a good way of explaining that is as follows. when we study things like geometry, what we study are perfect shapes. We study the triangle, we study the circle, we study the square, the rectangle, the rhombus. But if you were to look in nature for a perfect triangle, you won't find one. Because if you take the microscope to the triangle, you'll see all sorts of like...
Yeah. A Hummentaschen.
A Hummentaschen. Even a Hummentaschen. Yeah. You take a microscope to a Hummentaschen, you'll find irregularities in... I mean, the edges of a triangle in Euclidean geometry are infinitely thin, whereas the edges of any triangle that you come across in the natural world will have some size to them, some thickness to them. A perfect circle has an infinite number of sides, but you won't find a perfect circle in nature. You'll find approximations of them. So what we're studying when we study geometry are these abstract perfections. And Plato had this kind of concern. Well, if we never see them in nature, how do we know them? We never come across these. We come across approximations of them in nature. And Plato's answer was that, well, when we were in heaven, before we were born, we became acquainted with the perfect circle, the perfect triangle, the heavenly versions of these earthly shadows that we see around us. The impact that this thought has on his philosophy of education is as follows. In the Meno, which is an early or middle dialogue of Plato, Socrates starts speaking to this slave child, completely illiterate, and by asking a series of questions, and only by asking questions, he leads the slave boy to figure out Pythagoras' theorem about triangles, right? How does he do it? Just by asking questions until the kid comes up with it himself. And Socrates is like, you see, he knew it already. He just needed to be teased out of him. Now, many philosophers subsequent to Plato disagree with this notion that kids actually have all knowledge somehow hidden deep in the depths of their souls that just needs to be recalled, re-brought to the surface. But even if Plato was wrong about the metaphysics, he was wrong about this notion that children have within them locked up all of the truths of the world and that just need to be unlocked. Somehow, Socrates' method of teaching might work anyway, which is that you don't have to believe that Pythagoras' theorem was hidden there in the child and Socrates somehow unleashed it. What you might think instead is that these leading questions themselves help the child to discover something new, to discover something he hadn't known before. But still, in any form of education today that's child-centered and that lets the child somehow take a lead, any form of education that is question-heavy, where the teacher kind of prods the student by asking leading questions, that's known as Socratic education for this reason. Aristotle is of the view...
Before you get to
please
Aristotle,
do, yes.
No, there's this is fascinating. I don't recall ever hearing the concept of the Platonic ideals in terms of it being something that the soul was aware of before.
Yeah.
And in terms of associations, are you going to talk about the malach in the womb?
Yeah, the Masechet Nida. Yeah,
okay,
in fact,
so
I was going to.
I won't preempt that.
No, I was going to.
I'll leave it to you. But the other...
Yeah, I forgot. The other thing, yeah.
It's just very reminiscent of the Midrash also that talks about Moshe struggling to build the various utensils of the Mishkan, right? The fact that the menorah needed to be made out of one solid block of gold.
Yeah, he couldn't figure it out.
He didn't know what to do. And God showed him the vision of this is what it's supposed to look like. And Moshe just could not until God says, okay, throw it in and out. And
he showed him the Platonic form of the menorah. Right.
Yeah, and the Midrash is highlighting the fact that he wasn't able physically to get to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me backtrack a bit. Before Aristotle, I had meant to mention the Gemara in Masechet Nida. So there's reason to think that a number of rabbis agreed with Plato and this Socratic method of education, adopting a theory that's almost entirely identical. According to the Gemara, there is an angel an angel in the womb that teaches all of the Torah to the fetus as it's there growing in utero, and when the baby comes out, the malach touches the lips of the baby coming out and says kind of shh, and causes the baby to forget everything that they learnt.
I think it's more smacks him.
It was smacks him, yeah. But we leave it leaves a finger imprint, the kind of the gap, the kind of groove underneath a person's nose is like the imprint of the finger of the malach that smacked us as we left the womb, causing us to forget. But then, if you take that agadata at face value, it turns out that the lifelong process of a child learning Torah is actually a lifelong process of recollection. So it's learning as remembering. And that is exactly what Plato and Socrates thought learning was.
That's very interesting.
Aristotle, go on.
Are you going
You just
to
don't want to hear
John,
Aristotle, do
John
you? You've
Locke
got
later
something
on?
against Aristotle.
No, I do. It's just so interesting. But are you going to mention John Locke later also? Because I don't want to...
Yeah, sure. I'm going to get to Locke.
Fine.
I'm going to get to Locke
So never
as
mind.
well.
So I have an image. I have a metaphor for later.
Okay. So
based off of what you said.
So Aristotle disagrees with Plato and actually thinks that the baby is born as what's known as a tabula rasa, which means a blank slate. There's no innate knowledge that needs to be unlocked or hidden reservoirs of knowledge that need to be recovered. No, you're born a blank slate, and you start learning as soon as you start hearing and seeing things. And you need to be very careful what you expose the child to, because the more you write on that slate, the more set in its ways it can become. In modern philosophy, you have, and what I mean by modern, I mean the period of modernity. So it's not contemporary. Early modern philosophy starts in the 17th century. Okay, so in the 17th,
just a few days ago,
in the 17th century, you have these two schools emerge: rationalism and empiricism, and not perfectly, but imperfectly, they track Plato and Aristotle respectively. The rationalists, like Plato, believe that we're born with innate knowledge. We're born with certain things that we know. For example, one vestige of that today is this idea that our brains, and Noam Chomsky has this view, that our brains have grammar hardwired into them. And that's how we're so able to learn languages, because already neurologically written into our brains is the kind of shapes and structures of grammar. The rationalists believed that we had various pieces of innate knowledge, not quite in the way that Socrates thought, which is that kind of have been pre-learned and the teacher just needs to unlock them. Rather, the rationalist thinks we have this ability to see certain truths without any need for empirical evidence, without any need to go into the laboratory. So we learn mathematics this way, for example. We learn geometry this way. Our teachers can lead us to see the truth, not with our eyes, but somehow with our minds. That's the rationalist notion of education, whereas the empiricist said, no, all education, even mathematics and geometry, we only come to learn through experience, through trial and error. And that's John Locke's theory in a nutshell. John Locke was the founding empiricist if Descartes was the founding rationalist. Did you have something more in mind about John Locke?
Well, I just, in terms of blank slate, I had not realized that it actually predates him.
Tabula
from
rasa,
Aristotle.
the blank slate.
And so just in terms of the imagery of that, I was thinking that it sounds like Plato is more, if you think of those children's toys that you can buy in a booklet where it's like a scratch off, where
it's right, scratch off.
Like remove all the cover thing.
That's right.
It makes your table and floor incredibly filthy, but then underneath it is this beautiful
yes, and
picture,
I think that's why the
whiteboard
rationalists can be in some sense compared to Plato, because even though they don't think your knowledge is there to be discovered, they basically think ignore all the distractions from the outside and then you'll see the truth of mathematics and geometry. Whereas for Locke, no, there's no other way to learn than through the experiences of your senses. That's why they're called empiricists, because it's all about the empirical.
That's interesting.
But that's very nice. The Platonist is about, and the rationalist are about removing the obstacles, and then knowledge will emerge. And,
right.
And the Lockean is more about, no, you need to kind of, you need to
experience it to yourself. Yeah.
You need
build it
to
up.
implant the knowledge and build it up.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that a little bit from the psychological standpoint, which is interesting because there are a lot of parallels. But just when you were discussing luck, so I was reminded by one of the earliest behavioralist, the father of behaviorism, John Watson, in 1930. So he very much focused on behavioral aspects, and he has a very famous and controversial quote. I just brought it up to bring the whole one. But he said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." This is an extreme example of that school of thought.
That's right, of the blank slate. That school of thought doesn't think that some kids have an innate ability. Some are innately musical, some are innately... And the truth is, like so many fundamental machlokot in Western philosophy, the truth is probably some sort of synthesis of the two, which is that, yes, kids have certain dispositions, netiot. They also have certain learning disabilities or whatever they can have, so they can have certain obstacles that other kids don't have. But at the same time, trial and error and experience are really going to be the keys to learning. And at a certain point in your education, there's no shortcut. You just have to sit and learn the data. You have to sit and learn the material input, which is a more kind of empiricist notion. And I think you can be an empiricist and still think the Socratic method works, but you just describe what's going on differently. You say these questions are not helping a child to remember what they already knew, but the questions are leading, and they're leading the kid to experience something new. And so I think you can merge the schools together. And I think the considered rabbinic view would probably be a combination of these schools of thought. Because on the one hand, you've got the angel teaching us everything before we're born, which sounds like exactly the Platonic metaphor. But on the other hand, there's a notion that each person has an individual soul, and souls are different. Certainly in the Jewish mystical tradition, the notion that souls have different netiot, have different dispositions, inclinations. So I would probably endorse a synthesis of these two streams of thought, the tabula rasa view, the blank slate view, and the learning as memory view. There you go.
Thank you.
Psychology Corner.
So it very much interests me what you shared. I'm going to share something that's somewhat similar, but a little different from a psychology perspective. But first wanted to share a theory of cognitive development. I think it might be it's taught in all the intro to psychology courses. So it's would make me say that it is, or also developmental psychology. This is what people base off of.
So it's a kind of an orthodoxy.
Yeah, in a way.
Is it fair to say, or a standard view?
Yeah. Who was French. I actually forgot to I think he was a pediatrician, but I could be wrong. But a psychologist. So he has a theory of cognitive development where he split up the children's cognitive development into 4 major stages. It's kind of interesting that his research, I think, it was mostly based off of observing his own children at first. The first stage, he splits them up also into sub-stages as well, but we'll just talk about the general outline. The first stage is called the sensory motor stage, which is from birth to around 2 years old. And what in that stage, what infants do is they understand the world through their senses, through experiencing it through their 5 senses, and also through physical interactions. They're not really able to internalize any type of mental representations, and they live in the here and now, right? This concept very much when we play peekaboo with a child, that part of the reason that it's a game is because of the fact that at a younger age, a very young age, if something is not there, so it ceased to exist, right? In other words, that if I don't see the ball, I don't have a mental representation of the ball. If I don't see it, it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
At a very young stage.
This is object permanence.
Yeah, object permanence,
right?
Yeah. So if you cover it, even if you see them at a young stage, they see you, covering it, they'll be like, where's the ball?
Where's it gone?
I don't know where it is. I mean, they won't be able to say all those words.
Yeah.
Because if they can say
but
those
there are
words,
ways,
they can recognize
that
us under the
cognitive scientists use to measure surprise in babies, aren't there? So anyway,
Indeed. Yeah, and so they're learning things like cause and effect, that when I push something off the table, it's going to fall. That's often why children will make huge messes or repeatedly throw
and when
things
it
down
goes
because they
out
want
of
to
sight,
see.
it's not disappeared.
Yeah.
Discovery.
Yes, so that's part of it, but also in terms of gravity, right? Figuring out, if I push it down, it falls. And if it falls, then a parent's going to pick it up and say, no, why don't stop doing that? Right, so that's also in terms of how they're learning about the world and exploring it. The second stage is called the pre-operational stage, which is from around the age of 2 to 7. And a sentence that might fit with it is, I know what I see, and I also think that everyone else sees it the same way. At this stage, it's really a huge development in terms of language, the ability to communicate through language, and a certain level of symbolic thinking, but definitely not all the way there yet. But it's marked also by a certain egocentric viewpoint, not in a negative way, saying, oh, kids are so egotistical, but the way they understand the world is through their own eyes. They're not capable of understanding it through the eyes of others.
From what I've heard of the cognitive science, as this theory has kind of echoed through generations of cognitive scientists, it's been presented to me as if these are programs that come online at certain stages in the child's development. So at this stage, object permanence comes online. At this stage, and there have been cross-cultural studies that show that the nurturing environment of the child only has a marginal effect on whether or not these things come online at these times. If that's true, then
it's more platonic.
It's a little bit more platonic because there are these kind of like programs that are hardwired into the architecture of the brain that come online at a certain stage. But I'm not sure that's true, and I already feel bad for weighing into the psychology corner, because I don't think you need to hold that view to find Piaget's stages appealing.
I think it could fit with either one, and now I feel guilty because I feel like I didn't let you speak at all in the flat. But I think that's part of what this podcast is. We're sharing the
philosophy and
insights
psychology intertwined with Torah and parenting.
Yeah.
It's a thing of beauty.
In terms of younger children's egocentricity, so it can come across in the fact that, like, let's say if a child needs to get a present for someone else, so what are they going to get? They're going to get the thing that they want, right? If you ask a 5-year-old, they'll buy a birthday present for you. It's going to be the things that they're interested in. I enjoy it, so that means everyone does. And often children will be hyper-focused on various things. In other words, meaning that they'll focus on like one aspect of a situation, which it connects to emotional development and regulation as well, right? If something bad, so from an emotional standpoint, children experience things more intensely because of the fact that, oh, this toy was taken away from me and I'm sad about that. That is the only thing that's going on in my life right now. There's nothing else. All right, so that's also what's going on from a cognitive standpoint as well. I think that's so
important for us as parents to recognize. It can be hard sometimes because the kid's just acting out and it's completely out of proportion to the stimulus. Why are they crying so much about this stupid toy or whatever? But that's from our perspective. From their perspective, this really is very serious. A toy being broken or the emotions that they're feeling are just as real as an adult would feel for something much more catastrophic.
Yeah, for sure. At this stage also, so kids, they connect a lot more to visuals, to stories because of this stage that they're at, role-playing, things like that in terms of games, right, playing imaginative games, right, playing family. And maybe while talking about Piaget, I'll also overlap with that Mishna from Masechet Avot, that this is the stage. It doesn't line up 100% in terms of the ages, but this is the stage when one is meant to be teaching their children Tanakh, right, which is very much a large part of it is the stories, is the narrative of who it is, right? And that's why kids connect to that at this stage a lot better way. The third stage in Piaget's theory of development is the...
So would you summarize the first and second just in nutshell?
Yeah, sorry. The first one is what I said was the sensory motor, where the world is experienced through the senses, right? Cause and effect to affect the world like in a very physical way, and that's until the age of 2. And then what's called the pre-operational from 2 to 7 is that I see things and I understand it in my own way and assume that everyone else also sees it the same way that I do. Logic is not really so developed at that second stage. In the third stage, then logic starts to become a lot more prevalent. It's called the concrete operational stage from around the age of 7 to 11. So even though there is more logic, the logic is much more concrete and tangible. right? Sorts of educational concepts I won't get into in terms of conservation, of volume, reversibility, right? You can't always make things go backwards. The kids are a little bit better at taking perspective, taking other people's perspective, understanding cause and effect a little bit better. They can start to solve multi-step problems, but things that are more abstract or hypothetical are more difficult for them. And what they really connect to is rules, categories, things of that sort, right? If you think about kids, so they'll assume, for example, right? So, certain people are like this, or boys are like this, girls are like that, adults are like this, children are like
they'll
this. They'll
enjoy categorizing people and things at that stage, right?
Yep. Yeah, because that's how they make sense of things also.
Yeah.
I mean, we do also as adults, but usually with a lot more complexity.
Taxonomy.
Yeah. And that's from the educational aspect when we talked about that Mishnah. Also, that's the point where we're teaching Mishnah, right? What's Mishnah? A lot of Mishnah, right? It's a clear debate and rules and categories, right? This is the principle. And we can understand the Mishnah better, but it's a lot more straightforward, right? It's black and white, right? This opinion says it's allowed, this says it's forbidden. It gets less into the sources and the reasons why, and the cases where, even though they debate about this case, they don't debate about other cases. They agree in one direction, they agree in the other direction. So that's not Mishnah. That's more Gemara, and that's more the Talmud that we'll talk about in a moment. But kids at that stage, their abstract thinking and complexity of thought is just not as much there. And then the fourth stage is called the formal operational stage, from 12 up, where children can start to think more above, right? From thinking about thinking, abstract thinking, hypothetical reason, using more deduction. They can understand metaphor, symbolism, paradox, things like that. There's greater interest. In our podcasts on adolescence, we talked a lot about the development of identity and meaning. And this is the stage where being able to learn the Talmud is also more relevant from a reasoning standpoint.
To push back a little bit, I don't experience the adolescence of my two older children, for example, as a time of tremendous nuance, right? I see them being still quite stuck in black and white ways of thinking. When's that supposed to stop, Aaron? Help me.
35, 36. No, but he does split also that stage into two other stages too. And I guess what I'm talking about is more relevant for the later stages of adolescence. What the Mishna talked about was from the age of 15. Yeah. Right. So that's mid to late adolescence also. Yeah. So that's something that does develop over time. Usually black and white thinking will continue. I mean, it continues all of our lives also. Yeah. But there are points where we can engage in the grays more, but that's usually like later on. Yeah. Maybe late teens, sometimes early 20s. Yeah. Or later 20s. Yeah. That's something that's constant. That's why we learn Gemara all our lives, because only later on we could really get it.
And indeed, as you said, that might be what the chasing is a metaphor for. It's about chasing nuance. It's about going deeper into the things you already know. Yeah. So I wanted to also, in the psychology corner, talk a little bit about some other concepts. The concept of scaffolding, which I don't know. I mean, it sounds very similar to what you mentioned with regards to the Socratic method. Yeah. But I don't know I haven't read it inside, so I don't know if they explicitly build on it or not. But the idea of scaffolding in education is based off of a Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, passed away in 1934. Actually, no, I think about it. I don't know if he passed away. He's lived from 1896 to 1934. So things in Russia were dangerous at that time. I don't know if he passed away at the age of 38 or if something else happened. I should look it up. But he had this idea called the zone of proximal development, or ZPD, where there's this, let's say a child is at a certain place where they can master certain things up to a point, and beyond that point they can't. But a little bit above that, there's another point where they can achieve that if they have additional help. In other words, that there's a small gap between what a child can do by themselves and what they can do if they were given a little bit more assistance. Beyond that point of being given a little more assistance, they just can't do it, right? Even if you try to explaining quantum
mechanics to a 6-year-old. So, I mean, maybe you can if you're really great at making it simpler, but probably you're going to make it too simple that you're not actually teaching them what it is anymore. Maybe if you tried to explain it to me, maybe I would be able to get it. I don't know. But and he, in his thought, Vygotsky, is that's where growth and learning take place.
In that zone.
Of proximal development, right, between those 2 points.
That makes tremendous sense. I mean, as an educator myself, I very often aim to set my students readings between lectures that are just beyond their comfort zone. I know it's going to challenge them just a bit. Then they might understand 80% of what I've set them to read. But I feel like if I do that, then at the next lecture, I can kind of build them up that extra 20%. And I'll be like, we've got it now.
Yeah.
I
Exactly.
feel myself utilizing that ZPD without even knowing what it was called.
Yeah, so he didn't write as much about how to use it. So I looked up also in the meantime. Vygotsky died at such a young age because of tuberculosis.
Oh, shame.
So I apologize for insinuating that
anything
Stalin
that
might have
happened
something
in Russia.
to do it. I hope yeah. So anyways, so his theory was taken further by a number of psychologists. One of them, Jerome Bruner, who was more modern day. He passed away a few years ago. An American psychologist and educator.
One of Rabbi Sachs's
one of the
favorite
pioneers
thinkers.
Really?
Jerome Bruner, yeah. When I had Yechidus with Rabbi Sachs, he took me up to his office excitedly and photocopied me a chapter of one of Jerome Bruner's books and said, "You have to read the whole thing."
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway,
do you remember what it was about?
Yeah, it's about 2 ways of thinking. But I mean, I can't remember any more than that, really.
Okay, that's really interesting. No, it's really interesting. So he's a pioneer in cognitive psychology, and together with a few colleagues, developed this idea of scaffolding, which emphasized learning through discovery, and out of a belief that really you can teach children anything as long as you build off of where they're at right now by giving them like with a building. When you want to make it higher, so you build some sort of framework to help it get a little bit higher.
Yeah.
And the way that it works is that, you need to understand where the child is currently at, or not just child, but the learner where they're currently at. And you are constantly adjusting your help based off of their performance, right? So if the child is struggling more, so then you offer them more support. And if they succeed, so you gradually withdraw the support. As they gain more competence, so the external support is reduced in steps, which allows independent mastery for the child to take place. It's very interactive, right? Dynamic back and forth process. Teacher and learner are co-constructing the knowledge. It encourages autonomy. You want to try and empower them to think independently in the future. And there's a whole list of scaffolding techniques. For example, modeling, right? You demonstrate a task or a thought process. You say, watch me do this, and then you try. Hints and prompts, right? So you're not going to do it for them, right? But at a certain point you say, oh, maybe this, or start something. And that helps them move along. When you're doing it as the adult/teacher, you have a think aloud. Either you think aloud or you encourage them to think aloud. Breaking tasks down, providing feedback, providing encouragement, using a graphic system of organizing. And while looking into this more, I realized that I used this a lot a few months ago when teaching, or she'd already done it last year, but teaching our oldest daughter in terms of reading Megillah. Right, learning how to read Megillah Esther on Purim, and that the way that we would learn it is we would sit. I would lay in one pasuk, so model it, and it would be usually too much, right, to do one pasuk at a time. So then we break it up, right? So that's another technique. So there's the modeling, there's the breaking up, and then she's doing it. If she doesn't remember, I give like a small hint, and then bit by bit as she does it more and more, so then I take a step back, right? And then when we're reviewing it, so she'll read 10 verses all together, and then at the end I'll give some feedback, obviously some encouragement too, but realize that this is a way to really help children learn and develop. There is a lot more to talk about in terms of this, but I did want to talk about one last aspect from a psychological perspective before moving on to the practical stuff. I don't know if you had something you want to add about this.
Well, I've realized that there's philosophical kind of theory that I've written a little bit about in the philosophy of fiction that I left out of the philosophy corner, but I'm going to hold it until the practical corner. So you carry on, Aaron, with the next bit of psychology.
Okay. So up until now, really been speaking a lot about the development and cognitive aspects, which is part of what learning Torah with your kids is about. But if that was the only thing that we spoke about, that would be a shame, because there's so much more there as well. There is the aspects of helping with the child's spiritual development, their sense of identity, also, which we spoke about a number of times, but also wanted to talk about it from a relational perspective too. That a theory mentioned a lot in terms of attachment theory, the importance of being a secure base for one's children. So being able to learn with them also is if you do it in a certain way, this can also heighten your ability to be the secure base with them, and to also give them experiences that both focus on positive memories together, but also on the ability to handle struggle and frustration, right? In other words, if you're sitting with your child, I guess this is a little bit practical also, but in other words, it's an opportunity to help them realize, okay, I don't understand this, and that's okay, right? Maybe if I think about it more, if my parent asks me the right questions, I look at the commentary, maybe I can figure it out, right? Which is really a way to help them gain this sense of mastery. And a lot of it is about also this connection that we speak about too, developing the relationship. It's in terms of, let's say, narrative theory that we spoke about also in the past, that learning becomes a part of the family story in terms of what it is that's important to us. In other words, what activities do we do together? Because what is it that makes us into a family? So we also need to have learning be a part, or learning can be a part of that too. We're not yet at the practical corner, so I won't say that learning should be, but just from a psychological aspect, if that's what you do. So that also can be really, really important too. And if you think about the memories that your children have, God willing, when they're older, after we've moved on from this world, so that's also something that would be wonderful if this was the memory that our children have of us and of their childhood, of their early years, this warm feeling of support and connectedness that they experienced through learning as well. Where we have these, I don't remember where the source is, but Rav a description of attending a lecture of his father, Moshe Soloveitchik, where he talked about it was a magical experience where he felt that his father was bringing the Rambam alive, and the Rambam and Ravid were having it out, and maybe related to the pre-operational stage, right? Imagining these figures fighting it out in physical form in the Beit Midrash. But that's something also that I think is important to stress with regards to learning with one's children from a psychological perspective.
Are we going to get practical?
Oh, yeah. Oh, you wanted to share in the practical corner. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll say it now. I'll say it now.
Okay, go ahead.
So I co-authored a book with a philosopher in Ireland called Tatiana von Solodkov, a very Irish name. We wrote this book called Thinking About Stories together. It's an introduction to philosophy of fiction. And one of the questions raised in the philosophy of fiction is, how do we learn from fiction? And as you spoke about Piaget, one of the developmental stages corresponds to the stage of learning Tanakh, where we study stories and where stories are really engaging to the child. But one of the things that Catherine Wilson, a philosopher whose philosophy of education I sketch in the book, she says we have this misconception that learning is about accumulating data or accumulating facts. She says that's one thing you do when you learn, but that's not the only thing. You also shape a perspective. What's a perspective? So it's a way of organizing the knowledge that you have. So how much importance do you place on one fact vis-a-vis another fact? What emotional weight do you give to one fact versus another fact? So the kinds of weightings of importance, of centrality, and of also emotional and ethical valence that you use to organize the facts. That system of organizing facts, philosophers have started to call a perspective. And Catherine Wilson's saying, when you go to medical school, you don't just learn loads and loads of facts about a body. You also learn a perspective which qualifies you to assimilate new knowledge better. So, for instance, you go to the doctor having read up all of the symptoms you've read it up all on the internet. You say, well, I know as much as the doctor does. I've read it all up on the internet. Well, the doctor can say, well, no, it's not just that I know more facts than you do, right, about medicine, but it's that my training has given me tools for assimilating new information. So even if I discover a case that medical science has never seen before, I'm still in a place that I'm still better off than you are. You didn't have a medical education. I'm in a better position than you are to assimilate that new piece of knowledge into my overall body of knowledge. She says an engineer doesn't just know loads about Newton's laws of mechanics. They know how to do something, how to build new things. So I suppose the reason that this insight of Catherine Wilson about what education is, because she says loads of quite boorish philosophers who she quotes had said you can't learn anything from fiction because fiction doesn't have facts in it, right? And learning is all about accumulating facts. And she has two basic responses. One is, well, fiction does contain facts, right? It's not all false fictions. But more than that, fictions shape your perspective. And that is a major part of what learning is about. It's about shaping a thinker, which is much broader than just fact acquisition. And I suppose the reason I didn't think to share Catherine Wilson's perspective about perspectives, I think the reason I didn't think to share it in the philosophy corner is it's because it's almost practical. The thought is that, my thought here is that as educators of our children, we're not merely seeking to have children who can regurgitate facts. That might be the Mishna stage. I don't know which stage. We're also seeking to create thinkers with the ability to think and criticize and build arguments on their own. So it's a segue into the practical corner.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, both in that idea in terms of teaching perspective of Catherine Wilson, because I think it's something that I encounter. I think it puts into words what I experience sometimes with regards to halacha, to Jewish law, is that there's this feeling of, well, I can put in the details into ChatGPT, or I'll look up on a website what one should do in a certain situation, which is helpful in terms of finding basic information, finding sources, understanding things better, and people should be encouraged to do that. But there is sometimes a feeling that I get that when someone would independently get a conclusion based off of that type of research of, there's something missing. Like it doesn't feel right. But I think that concept of perspective maybe helps put into words a little bit more what it feels off.
I agree. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein has this essay where he distinguishes so beautifully between what he calls, and there was no terminology for this beforehand, so it's quite arbitrary what he calls it, but he distinguishes between psak and psika. And one of them is this kind of algorithmic, logical process. You just put in the halachic data and you get out the halachic conclusion. And this is what the halachic codexes do. Psak halacha, that they take the data, they assimilate the data, and then they kind of, it's not a very nice language, Rav Aaron wouldn't use it, but it's kind of spit it out. They spit the data out on the other end. Psika, says Rav Lichtenstein, is a kind of existential meeting between the posek, who's a human being, and the person asking a question. And the reason why the posek is so important is the posek has been shaped by years and years of absorption in Torah sources, such that his perspective is calibrated by Torah. And in this kind of existential meeting between the posek and the person asking a question, it's much less dry than what he described as psak, and it's much less algorithmic, and it's human in the very best sense of human. It's something that only humans could really do. And I think that what Rav Aaron is suggesting perhaps is that only in the human interaction do we get to see a Torah perspective at work. Because you read the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, he's not speaking to anyone in particular, right? But when he wrote a letter, when he wrote a responsum, he was answering a particular situation, which requires a different kind of mindset. It requires a Torah perspective. Rav Avraham ben Rambam has a letter where he stresses that his father had only meant the Mishnah Torah as a reference work to kind of aid people with more data, but he recognized that in actual human situations, the posek has to take in far more information than any formulaic codex can give you. And that's why you go to a posek who has been seeped in Torah for so many years that it's shaped their perspective. Anyway, there you go. So,
The Practical Corner.
For those, I'm going to start with the concept of perspective you were just speaking up, because it might be that people just skip ahead to the practical corner when they open up the
they
podcast,
shouldn't.
'cause they want to get to the good stuff. But yeah, so if you're just joining now, go listen to the last few minutes about perspective. But I'll start with those aspects that I think that are practical that relate to learning about perspective, is internalizing the fact that a lot of when we learn with our children is not just to gain knowledge, but to help realize that it's to help them get this perspective about what Torah is, what our way of life is, and also our own understanding of that as well. In other words, that's part of the educational experience too. Right?
Yes,
so it's not just setting them a reading list.
Yeah, I sometimes forget this myself, and I think it's something really important to keep in mind, that it's the experience of learning with their dad or their mum, right? Their experience of learning with their parent is almost more important than chomer that you manage to cover, the kind of facts you manage to accumulate, because it's a shaping experience to learn with your parents.
Yeah.
Right?
Both in terms of the content and in terms of the experience itself.
And the experience can help them to recognize the value of parent-child relationship and of what it means to stand in a Masorah, that you're teaching your children what your parents taught you and what their parents taught them, all the way up till Moshe Rabbeinu. That's a very shaping experience, to be aware of that.
Very much so. And I think to that end, often consistency can be more important than the quantity. Finding those opportunities, whether it's a bedtime story before bed, or early Shabbat morning when they wake up, or doing something at the dinner table during the week, or in Shabbat, or things like just something small to either learn together, tell a story, ask a question to them. It could be related to halacha or Torah or philosophy, different things that make it a part of their lives and a part of our lives as a family is really important. Oh, I did want to mention also modeling as being super important too, right? If we want our children to learn, so we have to show them, and not that we should be learning, but also it should be done in a way that's evident to children too, right? Not in a way that we're showing off, we're like, look at me type of thing, but it should be something that's open and given a place of value and prominence and importance also, right? So children should be aware if a parent is going to a shiur or waking up early or staying up late to learn, or in the morning or afternoon setting aside time. That's something that children should be made aware of also, to show that it's important to us and important for them. And what I refer to with regards to scaffolding is also something that we can and should be doing with regards to children too, because part of the learning is also helping them learn to connect to it on their own level, and eventually, right, setting them up to succeed at being able to learn independently as time goes on. So once again, it's not just about the material, right? It's about having them connect to it and develop that emotional connection, and giving them a feeling of ability and mastery, right? So I know with our oldest, when we started learning Mishna when she was 6 or so it started off, I would read it and explain it, and then when she could read, so then we take turns, right? She reads haltingly, and then I read, and then when she gets older, so then now she can start to explain it, right? And sometimes takes a little longer, sometimes flub it, whatever, make a mistake here or there, but that's the point, is that so that bit by bit, so now she's able to read and understand more. Hopefully one day do start doing it herself also, but that's in terms of part of what scaffolding is. I think there's a question that I always struggle with, and I don't know if I have a resolution to it, in terms of how much a parent should be pushing their child to learn together versus not. Because I remember speaking to one of my Rebbeim, Rav Daniel Schreiber, talking about Rav Lichtenstein, that he said that he would not, I could be misquoting, but that it wasn't that he was pushing his children to learn with him, but that it was, the way that it was framed was, as I'm going to be learning, and you have this opportunity to learn with me too, right now. And it's something that the parent is giving to the child. Or is that if you miss a session, so I owe you, right? The parent owes the child
Yeah.
this half hour or whatever it is. But the idea was not to create this like pressured environment where it's, it's another thing I have to do. I have to learn with my Abba, learn with my Ima.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there is a lot of value in that. But, right, there are points where you can't leave things fully up to the child also, because then you're not going to get much done, right? You do need to have some pushing, some consistency there also.
I think there's a degree of bribery be useful, which is that one thing my daughter and I are talking of instituting is an ice cream breakfast once a week where we learn together. And so if the learning isn't the key attraction, the ice cream is, that's not the end of the world, because mitoch shelo lishma bo lishma.
Yeah.
Which
day, or from a practical standpoint, what day of the week can you do that?
We're thinking of Friday mornings.
So when your kids are in high school in Israel, you have Fridays off.
Exactly.
So okay, fine.
So Sunday in the diaspora.
Ice cream dinners for the other Sunday mornings. Ice cream dinner for the younger kids. But yeah, we do that with regards to it. So when the children were younger, so then it would be like, and also they weren't at a shul where you get candy left and right and center.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm one to speak, like I'm handing out half the candies there. But so getting a candy was more special. And then, so it'd be, okay, we learn, and then you get like a little something, a candy, a cookie, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And now, it's funny, I don't do that with the youngest kids. Maybe I should, but then as you get older, so then we make a big deal about the siyum, right? You finish something, you finish some book, you finish something, so it's a big party with the whole, whatever, with the whole family.
Is a very good feeling anyway.
It's not a good feeling?
No, it is a great feeling anyway.
The
siyum, which just adds even more excitement, just the mere accomplishment of finishing something. There was a quite moving moment, many moving moments in the funeral of Rabbi Sachs, when Rabbi Binstock gave a eulogy, Dayan Binstock gave a eulogy, remembering that Rabbi Sachs had said that all he ever really wanted to be was one of those old men in shul who hands out candies to the kids. And Rabbi Binstock said just how many candies he's left us with, meaning all of the Torah he's left us with, these sweet kind of droplets of Torah he used as a metaphor for the sweets that he'd handed out. I think it's really beautiful because it animates what I think is the challenge with incentivizing education, which is, okay, at the beginning, they're coming for the candy or the ice cream or the whatever it is. But eventually the hope is that the Torah itself will become as sweet as ice cream or candy, and the Torah itself will be the incentive. It's about managing that transition.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, to help make it more meaningful unto itself.
That's right.
There's a lot more to talk about from a practical standpoint, but let me see if is the one thing that I feel like, I really, in terms of picking the right materials. Can you not hear me?
I want to ask you about
picking the right
how much
materials
do you censor
that
the
kids
materials?
Can connect to is also important in terms of whether it's pictures or stories or different things like that. I'm learning now Sefer Yehoshua with the youngest two, or not youngest two, whatever, the 6-year-olds. And we have a book of maps, also a map of Israel, so to show where things are, what's close to Netanya and what's far away.
I wanted to ask your opinion about this. To what extent do you censor the material? So, Sefer Yehoshua has some quite bloody material, or there are certain laws in the Chumash, right? You're teaching a 5-year-old, according to the Mishna and the Rambam, perhaps even earlier. But there are certain topics broached by the Chumash that are quite adult in nature. So how do you navigate that?
I think it's a really good question. It deserves more in-depth treatment. I'll note that Shira and I are in a different place here in terms of not in terms of what you censor versus not, but in terms of what you should be learning with them and what not learning with. I definitely think it depends on the child in terms of how there are children who, if they hear the simple readings of the stories in Yehoshua, they'll be having nightmares. And there's other children that, honestly, like in school, they probably hear worse. But I think that definitely things shouldn't be fully censored on the one, because you don't want to the salef to like pervert the actual story, to be making things up. But I think there can be a degree of deciding what to stress versus not in terms of where the child is at. And this comes up in terms of stories in Tanakh. It comes up, it's come up in terms of our learning Mishnah, right?
Yeah.
Are we going to be learning about certain topics or not? Because it can feel uncomfortable also. So there's different schools of thought. I've spoken to various of my teachers also.
Yeah.
So some say, no, you just go ahead, you learn it, and it's normal and natural, and kids connect to it as they do. And others have said, no, like you should make a conscious decision about when you teach certain things and when you decide to skip over various parts of it.
And like you said, it might well depend on the kid.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think also the question I asked about the Rambam in the Torah corner will depend on the kid and the parent. The question I asked to remind listeners was, to what extent is it an ideal that we transfer teaching responsibilities or primary teaching responsibilities to teachers? And to what extent is that just a compromise where actually we should hold on to the primary teaching responsibility, but we're incapable or whatever, so we rely upon teachers? I guess to a large extent that depends on the parent and the child as well, right? Some parents are better educators. Some children, I find some of my children are much less eager to learn with me than they are to learn with others. Depends on the child, I imagine. Or I hope it does. I hope it's not just they hate me.
No, sure not. But I think that also it's not always a dichotomy between parents and schools. Like it could be school and other educational frameworks too.
Yeah.
I remember Shira was at once a lecture, an event with Dr. Tova Lichtenstein, Lichtenstein Zatzal's wife, and an educator unto herself. And she talked also about, I think it was in terms of their own family, and mentioned how if you're expecting your schools to be providing the sum of your children's education, you are sorely mistaken. I think both in terms of overall content, in terms of perhaps she meant also in terms of how the content is taught and presented and delivered, but that we should definitely not be of the mindset that, I made sure that my children got a Jewish education because I sent them to this school or that school. Right? It's not meant to remove our personal responsibility towards educating.
No, and I sometimes think there's a place where possible. I try to find role models for my children, not just in school, but outside of school as well. So there might be a place for supplementing their extracurricular Jewish learning with the right sort of tutor, depending on the child.
Yeah. So you're saying I should read into the fact that you've never asked me if I have any time.
Would you be able to tutor my children? No, I just know how terribly busy you are recording podcasts and whatnot.
All right.
But it is an issue. I felt with all three of my children at certain points that, I must go and introduce them to so and so because that's going to be for them a powerful role model, given their interests and their inclinations and their sensitivities.
Yeah, I think that's also a really great practical tip too.
Yeah. There you go.
Sure.
Sometimes I can be practical.
Often are.
Yeah.
Applied psychology. Applied
philosophy. Applied philosophy. All right.
That's all for this week. I think so. Wishing you all a Chag Shavuot Sameach.
Shavuot Sameach. Indeed.
And tune in next time.
All right. Bye.